So Joe is an art design lecturer, also an AHRC funded PhD student here, Manchester Metropolitan University, where he is investigating the design and development process of the analog game industry and its application in design education. So I'll leave it to Joe.
Yep. Since I submitted that, I think a few words have fallen off my sort of de facto title. Just shift that there. I am going to get rid of. Nope, I'm just going to. Where's the full screen thing on here? This is not exactly sticking to 10 minutes, is it? Right. So, as Chloe just said, a little bit of background: retail designer for ages, art and design lecturer for a bit, PhD design for the last year, and game designer for slightly less. Hence the poster there, which I was going at UK Games Expo last weekend and felt guilty that I was essentially treating that as disposable. So people who work here go to see it a few times. So my work is about game design as a teaching tool, sort of explicitly in HE, but it may roll out kind of sideways as time goes on. So end of my first year, Lit review has been going okay, I think. I've written lots of things down, some of them won't make it. As I was kind of trying to digest all of these different educational theories, because if I'm trying to use game design as a teaching tool, I need to understand what people have thought about previously. And I'd read like a lot of the kind of the key texts, and I sat down and I thought, right, I must be able to put this into a visual way of understanding it, because I'm a designer by background and character. And I started off drawing pictures of like cells and different like proteins between them, and that was really forced and didn't work, and it was horrible. So my little shoehorning into the theme of the conference is that an unplayed game is environmentally indefensible. The teach, and I'm dealing more particularly here with board games, is a real barrier to play. If anybody's opened an instruction manual and it's been off-putting, you just tend to get something else off the shelf. So an easy teach will more likely make a game played, and that the teach, well, the words are quite similar to the whole idea of teaching. So, like I said, I needed to understand those theories in the same way. So I found a way of kind of understanding how these educational theories fit together, which may seem a little naive to some of the people who are a little bit further down the line, but please save your assassinations for the end. So I've tried to sort of use my understanding of how these educational theories link together in order to kind of apply to that teaching element of the games. So working through Skinner and Watson in the 1930s, started like studying this, like how learning worked, and their work was on animals. It was very, very sort of basic, direct response to external stimulus that becomes reinforced as time goes on. The reason for the jigsaw pieces will make a lot of sense on future slides, but fundamentally they were sort of seeing these are like individual chunks of knowledge that became reinforced over time. When we apply this to sort of a game environment, I don't know if that's how dogs learn. I haven't talked to any dogs recently. I do know that there are some interesting, the first couple of times you watch them and they're all kind of similar, people using AIs to learn how to do simple computer games where it knows it can do these 3 different things, and it knows what success looks like, and then it just does the things a lot of times, it iterates through it. And I don't really want to persuade anybody that that's a good way of playing games. So, introduction to how I was trying to understand the other educational theories that I'll run through is we've got this is your kind of inner body of knowledge. So we've got the absolute sort of foundational things, so potentially sort of your belief in God and your belief in gravity that sit right at the center, that are supported by all the other beliefs. And as you kind of get more sort of tenuously linked to these become more fragile, they become more overturnable. They become things that you would easily be kind of persuaded might not be correct. Yeah. And then obviously we've got unknown things, which is just this white space. So then we sort of start to think about how easy to learn things are. So we've got the things that you don't know, which are the empty jigsaw pieces here. If we look in the areas, I don't know if the people, you've probably got an absolutely horrific view of me online, I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that. So we've got unlearnable at the top there. That's not connected to any sort of framework. Yes, no, that's probably quite sensible. I'll take the keyboard with me as well. You've got things that are basically unlearnable. They're not connected to any kind of conceptual framework that you already have. For instance, if I were to start like trying to teach somebody here about like how radioactive decomposition happens, but somebody didn't even believe in atoms, then that wouldn't really behave. Whereas we've got things that are teachable, and then we've got things that are fitting in nicely with a lot of other things that you know, which are kind of a bit more kind of effortless, really. So kind of got here games you know, games that are similar to ones you know, and games that are too dissimilar to ones you know. And when I've handed a controller to my wife, who hasn't played a computer game since original Lemmings, pretty much, then she just gets frustrated and hands it back, even if it's something that she'd enjoy. Or like my father-in-law, who's, I don't know, he's a bright guy, doesn't play many games. If we get something with complicated rules out, then he's going to really struggle, and he's not going to have an enjoyable process. So then we look at Piaget from late 50s, whose idea of learning was essentially you have this internal framework, and you use this internal framework to compare with your sensory inputs. And so essentially you're sort of double checking what you already know whenever you're taking in sensory input. And then new knowledge is added if that sensory input sort of confirmed and fits in with the things that you already know. If it disagrees thoroughly with it, so I don't know, Paul went out that door earlier on thinking that might be a way to get outside. Yeah, you now know that that's not, because it was disproven. Yeah, so we can kind of squeeze this into games and understand games in the context, in this context of the individual constructivist. So this is an object that one can work out from its own intrinsic form. Yeah, so I think if you hand a Rubik's Cube to somebody, they're probably not going to think that it's something that you need to throw to people. Jigsaw puzzles is sort of like implicit self-evident games. Yeah, so you don't need instructions on Flappy Bird. It has a single control. Whether it's really a game is sort of debatable. Like you can't lose a hedge maze. Yeah, so these are like the self-evident ones. So these rely on those sensory feedbacks and those cues. So not sure how much we're assuming cultural background here. I'm also not sure if some of these count as games or just toys, but that's a bit of a sort of semantic decision, potentially. We then kind of move up the kind of spectrum, like the hierarchy of complexity, almost, with Vygotsky, who was actually writing before Piaget, but sort of behind Iron Curtain, didn't come to the notice of the Western people who form the kind of the narrative that I'm dealing with here, who involved the notion of a teacher. And the teacher in this case is like, they are, the way that I was understanding this is we've got a teacher and we've got a learner, and the teacher essentially examines the state of knowledge of the learner and then prepares a package of information that you could call a lesson, and then hands that to the learner. So it's a bit more tailor-made than just the sort of sensory input thing. Kind of acknowledging that these things are reciprocal, but it's been my experience that the good teachers are quite often the ones who can assess the ability of the learner the most accurately. So the same goes if you're speaking to somebody who doesn't speak first language, the same language as you need to assess where they're up to and act accordingly. So we've kind of got the idea of that sort of authored teaching thing going on. So if we go sort of a bit social constructivist, we've got authored teaching materials, so we've got deliberate lessons. This is sort of long been the default approach. So we've got in sort of reverse order, I don't know why these are this way around, we've got sort of traditional rule book kind of conception, whereas a rule book for a jigsaw is an unnecessary thing. We've got rules built into the actual like parts of the game, the elements of the game, like in a computer game, that could be easily be sort of tutorial level kind of things where you're guided through it. We've got sort of diagrams of what you press in order to do different things. And I think like the most sort of comprehensive version of this is the how to play kind of video from who is the most American looking man you could possibly imagine. And at the weekend after the games convention, we went back to one of my friends' houses, and I was reading the rule book and then just thought, this isn't sinking in for anybody. So we just watched a video and it worked. So I think there's a hierarchy of how effective these are. It'll depend on the situations. So then we kind of head to a legitimate peripheral participation, which Chloe looks a bit terrified by the thought of. Essentially, this is like an apprenticeship model. So we've got the notion of the master, we've got the notion of the sort of the more experienced member within a particular community, and then we've got the apprentices, and we've got sort of like a downhill flow of expertise. Yep, so we've got an implied hierarchy here. And when we apply that to learning games, and sports also fit into this, we're first seeing the notion of a group here. We've got the notions of that connectedness. Fundamentally, we've got the ability to ask why. Yeah, I can ask why till I'm blue in the face to a magic card with a complicated description, and it's not going to work. What we're doing is we're also seeing how experienced players play. We're being coached. We're being motivated by being a member of the group, because quite often I've sort of mentioned said in the past, like my gaming group, there are people there that socialize in order to play and people that play in order to socialize. And obviously we've got a great deal of motivation for humans as social creatures. I argue there's very, very few people that have ever sort of started from absolute scratch on tabletop role-play games. Most people are X numbers of generations from Gary Gygax, and everybody's learned from other people. I haven't written the instructions for the game that I played yet. That's my sidekicks demonstrating it. And then if we move a little bit further away from the games, that's obviously the model of like the sensei senpai to the karate students. And then Wenger, later on, right at the end of the last century, that makes it seem like a long time ago, sort of modified the legitimate peripheral participation concept into communities of practice, which essentially democratizes the same thing and acknowledges that everybody within a group is learning from other people in the group, because it's not a strict sort of hierarchy of Rob's better at this than me, so I learn from Rob, because there are things that I'm probably better at than you, and everybody's learning from each other. And then what that gives us is the idea of sort of essentially overlaying all of the mental models of the individual so we can map what the community knows. Yeah. So I suppose you could see that as within a company, you've got this level of knowledge and understanding. The diagrams get a little bit large at this point. So when we hit the communities of practice, everybody's playing to get better. Everybody's getting better by playing. It's kind of more about exposure to different opponents, different collaborators. And I don't know if this fits exactly here, but then we've got, I think it's important to recognize that these different groups will play with their own kind of idiolectical rules. So everybody here who played Monopoly as a kid would be playing by slightly different rules. And then if we've got these communities, implicit or explicit hierarchies, but we've got, for instance, like enormous online multiplayer games where people play them to quite insane levels, We've got like a wargaming club there. This is all very confrontational stuff. And we've got like a sort of a chess club model as well, which is possibly a little kinder, but it depends on the members of the club. And then we kind of end up with connectivism, which is a little bit awkward here, but this is the notion of, it's almost sort of like a giant version of this, which sort of looks at the collective knowledge of all of humanity. And it's prompted by the concept that facts are sort of no longer like the currency of knowledge. It's more sort of understanding and how people can relate things together, because we now live in a world where we're all carrying things around that we can look up pretty much any facts. So this was a difficult one. I didn't actually put any examples of games there because it's a little bit abstract, but it sort of acknowledges the communalities between the groups and the disciplines. And I kind of like the idea that if you take the people from the karate club that I pictured and send them over to the chess club and vice versa, they can each learn things from each other. And I think it sort of encourages the use of technological solutions. So hopefully now everybody's getting better at things. So when we kind of apply this, and there's sort of implicit hierarchy in these things, which I'm sure could be argued isn't necessarily there. But when we're thinking about how to teach our games, whether they be computer games, board games, or just sports, really, we've kind of got the area of you can just work it out. We've got an area where manuals and instructions are most appropriate. And then we kind of hit into where human teachers are. And then we've got the actual kind of socialized versions at the end which satisfy some social needs. Part of me wonders whether AI starts to kind of land in this section. But what we've got here is, as we go down this sort of area here, we've got sort of increasing resources needed to apply these things, increasing effectiveness, and I'd argue increasing enjoyability, because from my perspective, I much prefer to sit down with somebody who already knows how to play something and then like take that in and have it as a social aspect, rather than reading some kind of dry rule books or watching somebody go on about things that I already know.